welcome to Bad Cousins. This is episode 5. I'm Ben Schuman-Solar, and Matan Kaminer will join me right after this short intro. Anyway, sorry this episode is coming out a little bit later than usual. That's because I had a new baby, so I took some time off. But that gives us a chance to maybe do a quick refresher. So we started the series off with the question of why did they name the Abraham Accords after Abraham? And as we promised, that led us down quite a rabbit hole. So first, we tracked where it all started in the book of Genesis, where we learned about Abraham as the friend of God, the upright monotheist, and the patriarch, the father of 2 sons through 2 mothers. And then, in the last episode, we explored the twists and turns of the Abraham story after the Bible, in Jewish and Muslim traditions, but also in some strange medieval traditions that seem to be somewhere between Judaism and Islam. We talked with Yusuf Tayara. We talked about this term community of disagreement because people in the Middle East disagree on who takes after Abraham, but they disagree within this common framework that's set up by the story. Now today, we're going to make a major charge forward into the modern era, into the 20th century even. First, though, we're going to talk about the Christian side of the Abrahamic triangle. So we'll talk about how Abraham, and actually more prominently Sarah, plays a part in the first Christian intervention into the Middle East, which is the Crusades. Then we talk about how the idea of a Jewish state was taken up by British imperialists and their Arab allies, and how Middle Easterners started debating whether Jews and Arabs were actually cousins and what that all means. Again, we can't go an episode without talking about cousins. Lastly, in the second half of this episode, we bring on Liron Mor, who's an expert on Palestinian and Israeli literature. Liron and Matan talk about an Israeli rock opera from the 1980s called Mami. Turns out, I had no idea, that this rock opera also had some crossover pop hits. Okay. Anyway, the appearance of Isaac and Ishmael in Mami, where they play a role, so to speak, gives us an opportunity to think about how the Abraham story is used in Israeli culture up until today to make sense of how Middle Eastern Jews are both Arabs and not Arabs. So, we're going to cover a lot of ground today in episode 5, and we'll also touch some dark topics in this episode. But for me, once again, it's really bringing home the urgency of thinking seriously about these stories. It's not just some intellectual pastime. There are some real stakes in how we digest the Abraham myth. All right, let's get started. We will start off by talking about Christianity. Hey, Matan.
Hi, Ben.
So in the last episode, in episode 4 with Yusuf Tayara, we saw how Islamic and Jewish versions of the Abraham story developed in dialogue with each other from antiquity to the Middle Ages. But there's a missing piece here.
You mean the Christians?
I do. We've talked mostly about Muslims and Jews. So can we kick this off by talking about how Christianity has dealt with the Abraham story and the family drama?
Yes, sure. I think as we mentioned way back in episode 2, there are basically 2 Christian strategies for dealing with the Old Testament in general and specifically with the Abraham story in particular. One way is through allegory. So the church fathers, for example, treat the Old Testament as a sort of code. And they've developed a kind of allegorical key for that code such that, for example, every mention of Israel, especially in prophecies about the future of Israel, was reinterpreted as referring to the church rather than to the people of Israel in the literal sense.
Yeah.
And the second strategy is the fundamentalist or dispensationalist one that evangelicals like Ted Cruz espouse, if you remember his chat with Tucker Carlson. And this sort of reading is a much more literal one. So where the text says Israel, they say, okay, that means the people of Israel or the state of Israel, since that one exists these days.
Yeah. Just to follow up on the first one, on this allegorical strategy,
Mm-hmm.
Where does that start? Is that the one that starts with Paul?
Yes, that starts in the New Testament itself with Paul's letters, like the letter to the Galatians, right? So St. Paul, he was actually from a Jewish background himself, but he was the first Christian leader to really push hard to differentiate between the new religion and the old one, and to try to make sure that non-Jews would be welcome in it on their own terms. So in this letter to the Galatians, which is a Christian community in today's Turkey, he's arguing against some other Christians who say that if non-Jews want to join them, then they need to do all the Jewish things, like, get circumcised, keep kosher, keep Shabbos, etc. And Paul says no. He says the Jewish Christians can keep doing their things, but the ones who come in from the outside, the Gentiles, they don't have to, and in fact they shouldn't. They don't need to follow any of these old Jewish laws. Those are, in his opinion, the laws of the flesh, and they don't apply anymore. So he picks up the Abraham story, and he actually picks up on Hagar and Sarah to make this sort of allegorical point. He's not reading the story literally. Again, he's using symbology. It's in the figures are metaphors for him. So he says, my party, my school, my guys, the people who think like me, we are like the children of Sarah, who gave birth according to the promise, according to a sort of divine intervention. And the others, this other group that he's arguing against, they're the children of Hagar. Why is that? Because Hagar gave birth according to the flesh, right? There was no divine intervention there, supposedly. So this kind of lowly, merely corporeal relation to the holy law. And it's important to understand that he wasn't talking about Christians versus Jews. As I explained, he was talking, there's an intra-Christian kind of argument. But very quickly, as the church hardens into this thing, which is not Jewish anymore at all, and is even in many ways anti-Jewish, this story gets taken up by Christians following him as one about the Christians and the Jews.
So let's just make it very clear. For the Jews, Sarah is the mother, and Hagar is the mother of Muslims. For the Christians, Sarah is the mother of the Christians, and Hagar is the mother of the Jews.
Yes. Well, the Jews and the Muslims from the moment that they enter the historical stage. So if we skip forward to the 11th century, to the Middle Ages, now Islam has conquered much of the Middle East. The Christian Byzantine Empire is crumbling, and now Islam becomes the big enemy for Western Christianity. And they set off on this long, long effort to conquer Jerusalem and the Holy Land and to hold it against the Muslims.
Otherwise known as the Crusades.
Yes. And that's, like hundreds of years of fighting. And of course, there are still Jews living in the region at this time, and Christians too, under Muslim rule. As Yusuf pointed out last time, quite a few of them. But the Crusades aren't about coexistence, and they're not about people's right to practice their religion. They're about Christian supremacy. And this is kind of important to point out in a day and age when the U.S. the Secretary of War, has Crusader tattoos that say Deus Vult on them. So if you're Sarah's children, right, and you're trying to push out Hagar's children, guess what the rallying cry is going to be?
Right. It's going to be the one from Genesis, from the Old Testament, that Sarah says to Abraham very violently, cast out this slave woman and her child.
Exactly. And that's what the Crusaders were yelling as they sacked Jerusalem and as they massacred all of its inhabitants, were Muslims and Jews.
Yeah, and as we'll see, they're not the only violent group that have taken on this cry. So, we're going to make a big leap in time now to the 19th century. How are you going to get us from the Crusades to the 19th century?
Well, I think this leap makes sense because we're talking about Christian interventions in the region. So, the Crusaders, they eventually get their ass handed to them by the Muslims in the Middle Ages still. But by the 19th century, things are changing. The current Muslim regime, which is controlling most of what is today thought of as the Middle East, is the Ottoman Empire. But it's very, very weak. It's on its knees. And these European empires, which are all growing in strength, are kind of sniffing around, trying to get in there, see what they can grab.
Right. And this is also the context in which Zionism arises. So how do you sort of understand this?
So 2 things to remember here. First, there are still a lot of Jews, like Christians, who are living in the Middle East under Muslim rule, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Syria, Palestine, all over. And they're not Zionists. A lot of them actually become active in Arab nationalist movements. The second thing is that even among European Jews, Zionism isn't actually very popular until far, far later. And Zionism is actually a British Christian project already in the early 19th century, before there are really many Jews who are interested in it at all.
But then what are the Christian aspects to early Zionism? I don't think this isn't really part of the Zionism, common discourse knowledge.
Yeah. It's not what you heard in Sunday school, right?
Right. Saturday school.
Yeah. Okay. The Ottoman Empire is getting weaker and weaker, and one of the ways in which these European empires are starting to make inroads in there was through these agreements that they made with the Ottomans that are called capitulations. And according to these agreements, particular religious minorities within the Ottoman Empire would receive this sort of protection from these European empires. So, for example, the French, they claim to protect the Catholic populations of the empire. And Russia does the same for the Eastern Orthodox populations, which is another kind of Christians. The British Empire also wants a piece of the pie, but the British Empire is Protestant, and there are not that many Protestants in Palestine or anywhere in the Middle East, really. But one other way that they find of dealing with this is they say, okay, let's take patronage of the Jews, because they don't have, an empire to protect them, and we can also bring in some more Jews.
Yeah. This colonial feeling of not wanting to be left behind and sort of desperately scrambling to be part of this European colonial...
The feast.
The feast, yeah. It seems like a crucial element of the geopolitics and like power dynamics of the time.
Right. But as you know, as we're always saying that these things always go together, right? There's all this kind of ideology and religion goes together with these things. And they were also thinking about it in religious terms. Like we said, these are Protestants. The British state is a Protestant state. And a lot of intellectuals in Britain are thinking within this dispensationalist or fundamentalist frame that they want to see these biblical prophecies come true. So maybe more accurate to say is that they're kind of doing St. Paul and Ted Cruz at the same time. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, Israel is the Church of England, but the Jews are also Israel. So they can be our representatives in the region. They might have to convert to Christianity someday when the Messiah comes, but that's for later. We're leaving that aside for now. For now, we can these sorts of interpretations can even sort of merge together.
So this is before Jewish Zionism.
Yeah, and it is. It's the even early 19th century, which is before Zionism gets underway as a political movement. And I'm not saying that the Jewish Zionists were necessarily taking it from the English ones, but Theodor Herzl, late 19th century Zionist leader, founder of what we call political Zionism, he was very clear that if he wanted to get his goal achieved, then he would have to have European imperial backing.
Yeah. And that brings us, I think, to World War I.
Mm-hmm.
The British conquer Palestine, and then the Balfour Declaration happens. So the Balfour Declaration is an imperial declaration. Lord Balfour was the foreign minister. And in the Balfour Declaration, the language that they use is Jewish national home in Palestine. But the point is, at that point, Palestine is 89% not Jewish.
Mm-hmm. The Balfour Declaration is the British Empire's kind of adoption of Zionism as an official ideology. And as you've said, about 90% of the population of Palestine at this point is not Jewish. And also important to remember, as we mentioned before, probably more than 90% of the Jewish population of the world is not Zionist at this point. It's important to reiterate this because today we tend to think of support for the state of Israel, support for Zionism, as this kind of mainstream consensus position amongst Jews. But it really wasn't that way until long, long after the period that we're talking about now.
I think it's really important, especially now, especially after October 7th, when sort of anti-Zionism has become something you hear about a lot more as like a new thing.
Yeah.
And it's
including
not.
among Jews.
Including among Jews. And it's become like this very controversial, very polemical idea. But it's 100 years ago, most Jews weren't necessarily Zionists.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the people who live in Palestine at that point are obviously not happy about this colonizing idea. And yet, there are people around in that area who are not Jews, who are sympathetic to the British and to this sort of Zionist idea.
Yeah. You're talking about the Hashemites?
The Hashemites. So let's get into the Hashemites and their leader, King Faisal.
Okay, so today I think people will know this word Hashemite from the name of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So the king of Jordan, who is currently Abdullah, he is a scion of this family, which originally comes from Mecca, from the Hijaz region in what is now Saudi Arabia. And they were this noble family that was associated with guardianship over the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. During World War I, they make a pact with the British that they were going to revolt against the Ottomans.
With Lawrence of Arabia, right?
Yes, Lawrence rode with them, right. He was central in setting up this alliance. So according to the plan, in return for fighting the Ottomans, the Hashemites would get to be the lords of the Arab state that would be created after the war. And the British famously reneged on this, where the Hashemites do end up getting some role, but it's a much more diminished one than they expected to have originally. They're not independent states. They're mandatory colonies of the British, and King Faisal, a Hashemite, one of this family, eventually becomes the king of Iraq. Anyway, Faisal, He is pretty sympathetic towards the Zionists, because he's pro-British, of course. So right after the Balfour Declaration, he strikes up this series of negotiations with Chaim Weizmann, who is the head of the Zionist organization. And there's this draft agreement that they come to between them that really sounds like a blueprint for the Abraham Accords, like 100-something years in advance.
Yeah.
I'll quote from a historian, Neil Kaplan, who summarizes it. He says, the idea was, the pan-Arab leaders would benefit from Jewish development capital, technical assistance, and international political lobbying. In exchange, Zionists would benefit from Arab recognition of some sort of national existence in Palestine, and from pressure on the Palestinian leadership to moderate its hostility to Zionism.
It took us a while, but we got back to the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, we did.
All right, but Abraham's not part of this yet.
So Abraham's not in there as such, like he's not mentioned. But Faisal does go on a lot about being cousins. And he does repeatedly make this offer to the Jews that from being cousins, he would upgrade them to being brothers.
This is one thing that really stood out to me. When there's something when Jews and Arabs are negotiating or on good diplomatic terms, and there's something they can get from each other, they do start using these family terms, right? They say cousins or even more. But when not, then all of a sudden they start accusing each other of lying about their ancestry, about their inheritance, even about their like blood closeness to Abraham.
Right, right. So if we want to discuss like how people reject this framework, there's two moves that you can do here. And we've seen both of them historically. One of them is to deny that people are your cousins at all. And then the other one is to say, yes, they are cousins, but they're bad cousins. They're not doing their duty by us. And to simplify maybe a little bit, the Arab anti-Zionist position tends to be the one that says they're just not related. And the religious Zionist one tends to be the one that says they're bad cousins.
Yeah, so let's take that one after the other. This first move is saying, actually, they're not cousins. How does that work?
It's right there in the first Palestinian reactions to Faisal in his declarations. So at this point, most Palestinians are quite alarmed by the Zionist project, as we've said. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have something against Jews, right? Both back then and to this day, a lot of Palestinian nationalists are not making this conflation of Zionists with Jews. But I think what tends to happen in these situations is that when you're arguing with somebody and they make the simplification, this dichotomy between you and them, then it's really hard not to get drawn into that, to say, no, I don't accept this. So that starts happening with a lot of Palestinian nationalists at this point. Let's be concrete. We have this Palestinian journalist, intellectual, Hosni Abdelhadi from Nablus, and he has this to say to Faisal after this, the publication of his correspondence with Weizmann. He says, and I quote, "You say, we do not aspire to drive the Jews out of Palestine. Who are your partners, sir, who permit you to say we do not aspire? Do you mean that the Palestinian movement is a false one? Because we do want to drive them out by any peaceful means. You say the Jews are our cousins. I say they may be brothers of cousins to the people of Hijaz, but they're enemies to the Palestinians and the Syrians." So, I don't know, maybe I'm giving him too much credit. But a decade or two before, when Zionism wasn't as much of a threat as Palestinians see it as being by this point, I don't think he would have had a lot of Palestinians talking in this way. I mean, for example, in a place like Hebron, where there was this long-standing ancient Jewish community, and where the Abrahamic legend is very particularly strong because of the tomb there, the Abrahamic tomb, it was traditionally very much accepted among the Muslim population that the Jews who lived there did have a special connection to the place because of Abraham. And that's something that really gets forgotten and that has really gotten thrown out under the historical bus, so to speak, after Zionism becomes dominant.
Yeah. And so just to recap that, we have Faisal, an Arab leader of the region who made a deal with the British and is writing to a Zionist leader and saying, we're cousins, we're family. Let's figure something out. Let's work together. And then we have the Palestinians saying, hold on, who's the we here? Right. In fact, we don't see each other that way. I think it's important that we keep that complexity and diversity and dynamism that we've talked about in other episodes, in mind here, because this black and white thinking does start creeping in again in the 20th century.
As we mentioned, you could be an Arab nationalist and a Jew or a Christian. People and populations were mixed, especially in the cities. Jews and Christians, for example, tended to be spread out in urban concentrations throughout the region. Even if, as minorities, they had to pay these special taxes, right, which is obviously not fair. But there wasn't this idea that they had to be pushed out or concentrated somewhere else. That is really something that begins during World War I with the Armenian genocide, which is undertaken by the Ottoman Empire itself, of course. Right.
This ethno-nationalist trend is part of a much broader change that happens in the whole world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. After World War I, you have the beginning of a shift towards a big world of nation-states. And states and nations have to be congruent with one another. Every nation gets a state. Every state belongs to one nation. And they're supposed to have, as far as possible, homogenous national populations within them.
But anyway, without getting too crazy far off.
Yeah, let's talk about kinship again.
Let's talk about kinship. So, with this, is there a denial of kinship? Or how does that all play into it?
Right. So, like we said, there's basically two ways that you can deal with this sort of problem. Somebody's imputing kinship with these people that you don't want to be related to or you don't want to be associated with. So, as we've seen with Abdul Hadi on the Arab side, there's the rejection of kinship. He says they might be your cousins, but they ain't mine.
Right.
There's this, we could call it denial of kinship. And there's various ways that you can do that. One way that you can do it is by saying, well, the ancient Jews were one thing, the people in the Bible, but they've gotten so mixed up with other people in the meantime that they're really not the same people anymore and they don't have those rights.
Right. Even though they've been living next to each other for 1,000 years, they're saying, no, it's a different kind of people.
Yeah, you could say they're mixed. They've had their blood mixed with other people in the meantime.
I hate the blood arguments.
Yeah. They claim descent from Abraham, but they don't really have it.
Right.
So that's one thing you can say. Another thing you can say is, well, okay, the Middle Eastern Jews, they're a descendant from Abraham, but the European Jews aren't, right? There are some European people that converted some other time.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about like the Arab side of that and the Palestinian side of that, but what about the Zionists? Like they also had a way of denying kinship, right?
So with them, it's not the denial. With them, it's the bad cousin strategy.
Right.
As we've said, most religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, have not been Zionists historically, but you do have religious people in the Zionist movement. And in recent decades, we've been seeing the sort of merging together in an emergence of a religious Zionism, which is now very, very powerful, especially in what we call the extreme right, which is in power in Israel today. And this is the ideology of Meir Kahane, this sort of settler ideology that comes to the fore and really becomes very, very strong in Israeli politics today. So to get back to your question, they can't do this denial of kinship thing. Why? Because the Jewish tradition of interpreting the holy texts, as we've seen, from the Bible through the Talmud all the way to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, is very clear on the fact that Ishmael equals the Arabs, equals the Muslims. So what do they have as an alternative mode of justification? It's the bad cousins thing. Okay, they are our cousins, sure, but they've always been bad ones. They steal from us from the beginning. Remember, Ishmael himself, he was a wild ass of a man.
Yeah.
He was sent off to live in the desert because God knew what was good for everybody and that he better be kept away from everyone. So that's where he should stay, out there in the desert. And we have this much more ambivalent relationship to Ishmaelites, Arabs. It's not about denying that they're Ishmaelites. You can't really do that. It's about saying, well, they are our cousins, but they've always been bad ones, and we need to treat them very, very cautiously, or even be quite aggressive towards them because of that.
Yeah, it's more like a disowning, right? It's like this member of the family is a thief, is a killer, is not something that we welcome into our family, even though, yeah, we might be related, but they're not invited.
Yeah, there's that, but it's not just that, because they had the inheritance, right? They had the legacy once. They had the blessing, and they lost it. Ishmael was first. He was blessed by God.
Yeah.
And Hagar, within the Jewish tradition, within the Bible, there are all these sort of positive, even divinely chosen aspects to her. You can't just ignore those. But then what happens is that Ishmael loses what he had when Hagar gets cast into the desert the second time with him. So of course he's going to be bitter, right? The enmity with him is going to be, in some ways, much more difficult to overcome and resolve than the enmity that we might have with unrelated peoples.
I mean, you mentioned Meir Kahane. He's like the hero of someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's like an insane person. And it's true, like that the nationalist, that the extreme far right is now in power.
Yeah.
And it's made this conversation so much more urgent, I think, and so much more scary because the most extreme are in charge.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about Meir Kahane,
Okay.
and let's tie it back up to the story.
So Kahane, like a lot of the bad things in the Middle East, comes from the U.S. He was this American rabbi and kind of like rabble-rouser who moved to Israel and became the godfather of the radical religious right in the 70s and 80s. And he has this whole book, like a theological book on how Jews should treat Arabs. And in there he says as follows, allow me to quote, "The Ishmaelites see Israel as thieves, as robbers. They are thirsty for Jewish blood and will never abandon their aspiration to destroy the people in its land. Hence, they should be annihilated. And anyone who falters in this duty out of foolish mercy will be acting cruelly towards merciful sons of merciful men," that is, Jews. So by being merciful and nice to the Arabs, you're actually being cruel to Jews. And this is sort of an ongoing refrain on the Israeli right.
Yeah, it's obviously disgusting, and I don't want to give him any credit, but there is a nuance in the point, which is that it's not that they're thieves and robbers. It's that they see the Jews as thieves and robbers.
Yeah, this is the point that we were talking about before, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of the story in Genesis, the story of Ishmael. He had the legacy before Isaac, who came along and took it from him. So there's this kind of mirroring, right? There's what we call the community of disagreement. You can see yourselves through the eyes of the other, which I think is very much a part of the family drama vibe that we're going to be discussing with Liron.
Of course. And the Israeli far right that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, they love the Abraham Accords. These are some of the Abraham Accords' most strident supporters. They love this idea that the Arabs should stay in Arabia and the Jews should stay in Judea, and there are actually no Palestinians to them, right? And you actually mentioned that in a different episode, and some people wrote me about that. Like, what do you mean there are no Palestinians? Can you kind of expand on that?
We can think about it both in these geopolitical terms, in terms of this nation-state logic, right? Where each nation has a state, and if a nation doesn't have a state doesn't have a nation, then there's like some anomaly going on there. And we can also understand it in religious terms, like Ishmael belongs in Arabia, and Isaac or Israel belongs in Israel, right? So there are these separate countries, and according to both of these logics, Palestinians, that is Arabs, don't belong in Palestine, which is Israel.
Right.
This is what the ideology kind of amounts to. It's like, okay, there's this anthropologist, Mary Douglas. She talks about dirt as matter out of place, right? She has this theory that says, like, okay, something can be clean in one place, but dirty in another. A shoe. If it's in the shoe rack, it's fine. But if it's on the bed, then it's dirty, right? Things need to be in their place. If they're out of place, then they're pollution. They're matter out of place. They're dangerous. And so there's this. We were talking about this before, right? This within this sort of nation-state logic, and also this religious logic, people need to be in their place, and it can be reinforced with this kind of family thinking. So yeah, why is Ben Gvir so in love with the Abraham Accords? It's because it says, yeah, the Jews have Judea, right, or Israel, that's their country, and the Arabs have Arabia. Look, Saudi Arabia, it's in the name, right? United
Right.
Arab Emirates, that has the word Arab in it. So the Arabs should just fuck off and be over there. Cast out the slave woman and her child. It's that again.
Yeah. The settlers also use that, right? When they carry out these kind of pogroms against Palestinian villages. Don't they also use that?
It's a favorite aphorism of theirs as well. And I don't think they care that it makes them sound like crusaders.
All right. So our guest on today's show is Liron Mor.
Yes. So, I say this about all of our guests, but Liron is really a very, very, very good friend of mine. And she has a great book called Conflicts about Palestinian Israeli literature. We wrote this article together about how Mizrahi Jews, that is, Jews from the Middle East, are sort of set against Palestinians in Zionist cultural productions.
What kind of productions are we talking about here?
So there's three. There's this short story from the early 20th century by Haim Hazaz, who literally none of our listeners will ever have heard of. I've barely heard of him. And then there's this television show called Fauda.
Yeah, I watched a couple episodes of that when I had the flu once. I'll admit it.
Okay. Yeah, I've vaguely heard of it as well. And in the middle, there's this insane rock opera from the 1980s called Mami. That's Mami. It's about a poor young woman who gets brainwashed into becoming a fascist gangster. It's kind of weird, but it was also a really, really big hit. And we're going to be zooming in the interview into a specific song in the opera in which the heroine appeals to Palestinians who are about to attack her by invoking the story of Isaac and Ishmael.
Yeah, and we'll listen to some of the music also. But before we move on, we should warn listeners that this following conversation includes a pretty extended discussion of sexual assault, and it happens in the context of this sort of racialized conflict. That's the trigger warning.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's also a part of this story.
All right, well, here's Liron Mor.
My name is Liron Mor, an associate professor of comparative literature in the University of California in Irvine. And I'm Mizrahi myself. And I find this entire story that Matan and you Ben are working on to be fascinating, especially the way it's spliced up into these different periods and elements. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for being here. All right. So the way that we want to kind of attack this issue is through Mami. This Israeli rock opera that we've both actually written about together. Maybe the best way of starting would be if you could, Liron, sort of tell us what Mami is, what the opera is.
Okay, so Mami, as you mentioned, is a rock opera that was written in 1986 by Hillel Mittelpunkt, and then staged a year later in 1987 in Tel Aviv. And it's important to mention that Hillel Mittelpunkt, who is Ashkenazi, wrote the words and lyrics. The story is the story of Mami, a very kind of sweet, young, naive woman from a development town in the south. She's specifically North African. The name Mami puts her within that community. It is a term of endearment that is absolutely associated with Moroccan Jews still, even today, when it's very common in Hebrew. And the story of Mami opens with her working at the gas station diner, about to get married. Everything is looking lovely. This is the opening scene. I think I'll stop here and we'll see where it goes.
Mami's fiance gets badly injured in the army in a battle, and it becomes like a paraplegic basically, and so they have to move to Tel Aviv in order to make a living, where she gets a job in a bar. From the beginning, it's made very clear to her that her job involves a sort of sexualized humiliation by the customers of the bar. And the other element of the story of the scene is that there are also Palestinian workers in the bar, workers who live in the basement. They're Palestinian migrant workers, basically from the West Bank or from Gaza. This is a period in which there's a massive use of cheap Palestinian labor within the Israeli economy. What happens in this scene is that basically Mami is assaulted by the Palestinian workers in the bar. Again, we have to remind our listeners that this is an Ashkenazi-authored fantasy about violence and sexual violence, especially between Mizrahim and Palestinians. And then she gets rescued.
Yeah, so she's rescued by the Worms, who are a fascist gang, and they save her last minute.
Mami, Mami, תפתחי את הרגליים לשבעה מדוכאים, שבעה פלסטינאים.
Maybe one more thing is that this was the major hit from the opera. Like when I was a kid growing up in Tel Aviv, I heard people singing the song and I didn't even actually realize what the context was. And maybe the second thing to say about that is that when the opera was first performed, it wasn't a big hit, but then somebody had the brilliant idea of distributing tickets to soldiers for free. And then the first Intifada broke out, and then the opera became really very, very, very popular. And then also the rape song in particular becomes this sort of like almost like a folk song that I heard as a high school student. People like just kind of like strumming to themselves on a guitar, and I was never really sure what was going on, like what the song was about, and why people were singing a song about Palestinians threatening to rape a Jewish woman, until I later discovered that it was actually part of this opera. So she says to them, "Listen just one moment before you take off your pants. Ishmael and Isaac were brothers, and we share a single father in heaven. You were born in a refugee camp, hot in the summer, in the winter cold. I was born in a development town. We were cast in the same mold. Like an Arab worker, I was exploited in the gas station, behind the counter. You got bummed, I got bummed, we all got screwed over." What do you think the Abrahamic family story is contributing here?
Yeah. So I want to say first just that this the form of address that she's using, she's starting with the fraternal, with brothers, and what I think is doing is the sense of symmetry, and of appealing to someone on equal footing, and it helps that the stories of Ishmael and Isaac are so full of moments of mirroring in the Bible itself. Before we even mention the Quran, there uh, two banishments of Hagar, and then there's the binding of Isaac and the banishment of Ishmael. So um, all of those repetitions, Isaac being named after Sarah laughing, and then Ishmael getting banished because he laughed at Isaac. So there are all these repeated kind of doublings and symmetries, and mirrorings that are really useful when we read this song and other invocations of the two brothers, because what they tell us is that despite all this difference between them, they're brothers, that they're on equal footing, that what was promised to one is also promised to the other. And so when Mami begins her appeal, her address with that invocation, it is first of all to say, we're on equal footing in a situation where she works the front of the house and they work the back of the house, and that is representative of the nightlife and restaurant world in Israel. And I'm saying that as a former waitress. And so her first step is to erase the difference of their positions within the political economy of the bar, let's say. And then she starts getting into details of how exactly they're similar.
I
And
mean, okay, so we're talking about sameness and difference, right? We're talking about this sort of, we have that doubling of the name there and the slash. There's always kind of this, I feel like a sort of gravity well that pulls us towards these dualisms, right? That there's always twos there, and the Mizrahi question really kind of breaks that apart, right? Because the Mizrahiyut, like the Mizrahi identity in a way is forged in Israel as a result of the impossibility of being both Jewish and Arab, right? That it becomes impossible. It wasn't always impossible. In fact, we've already discussed on the show how it was not at all impossible for Jews in the Middle East for hundreds of years, and then becomes impossible as a result of both Zionism and Arab nationalism, right? As this sort kind of the growing sense that you have to belong to either side of a binary.
Mami's parents, in the way that we want to imagine them, thought of themselves as Arabs. They thought of themselves as Jewish too. And in no way did they think that those identities were in conflict. They spoke Arabic, they dressed like their neighbors. And then the migration to Israel is a break in that story, where they're being severed from this past. So it creates this kind of internal split where people have um, to see a part of themselves as the enemy or entirely give up on it. And what we're seeing with Mami is that severance is not fully complete. The comparisons, the simile, like an Arab worker, which is interesting because in Israel, Arab labor is this code name for cheap labor, exploited labor, and badly done labor. And the fact that she's invoking this, she's describing herself as an Arab worker, or at least someone who is like an Arab worker, is already trying to kind of again draw the similarity, but also say something about the way that Arab Jews were treated in Israel in its first, 20 years. And that is this claim of, being exploited in the gas station, living in a development town, which is like a refugee camp to the extent that it held people captive. And this is a part of Zionist history that is less talked about. There's something kind of different about this song because up until this point, Mami is willing to deal with anything that is being thrown at her. And she's, this kind of relatively happy person, even when her husband becomes a paraplegic. But here she's talking about all the bad things that have happened to her and people like her. And all of a sudden there is all this, you got bumped, I got bumped, we all got screwed over. So it's interesting that it's in this encounter with Palestinians that she finally realizes what has happened to her or what Zionism has done to her. And that she's willing to talk about it and not just kind of repress it.
And one the other thing that it ties into, I think that we were talking about today, is about how we're talking about Abraham and Sarah, and how there's a lot of sort of liberals are identified with Abraham because Sarah's the one who does the dirty work for him,
Yeah.
right? She's the one who casts out Ishmael, and he gets to be the nice liberal daddy who just wants everybody to get along.
It kind of reminds us of the status of women in the kind of the world that we're in as those stories are happening. I have a special resentment to the reading of Sarah as this, the sovereign mother who made it all happen, this strict, whatever good mother, the good mother who is the mother of the nation by banishing the other woman. And it's such a bizarre reading. At a very textual level, things are even clearer. I mean, she's kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy because she's unable to conceive, and the only option available to her is to basically give her husband another woman. So there is something about this that says, first of all, the hierarchy between the two women is not as clear cut as that reading makes it seem. In fact, there's a reason that once Hagar becomes pregnant, she starts, looking down at Sarah because the hierarchy in the household is based on the ability to deliver a male child, and not necessarily on the predetermined we don't know that Sarah was really like the mistress of the household. We know that her status is actually dependent on being able to be pregnant, and she's not. Um, and so the story seems way more complicated to me than this like ridiculous reading of Sarah as like the, the voice that makes everything happen. Again, Abraham going along with her is surprising given that in other episodes he's not.
So are there shades of like, Ashkenazi Mizrahi relationships and this sort of projection of hatred towards the Arabs, of racism towards Mizrahim?
I find that the biblical story to be really interesting there, where Abraham is presented as just like a vessel of God. He's just like, God tells him what to do and he's just doing it, and he's just saying what God is telling him to say. But then when God is about to destroy a whole city, all of a sudden Abraham is willing to speak up to the law. And those two modes of Abraham, like I feel like there's something interesting in the fact that there's not a lot of scholarship on the negotiating Abraham, who is, if we take it to discourses today, would be associated with the Mizrahi kind of Abraham, who is taking the law again. And this is, I'm not saying it's a genuine representation of reality, but it's definitely a genuine representation of Israeli discourse about Mizrahim. And so Mizrahi traditionalism is viewed as this kind of not accepting the law to its letter, and having a word with God, and kind of trying to negotiate. And I think that's it.
To fill in blank for listeners, that I think, well, the way that these things have been constructed in Israeli society today, we have Ashkenazim, European Jews, are either atheists or ultra-Orthodox, like very, very strongly religious and following the law to the letter, etc., all of this. Whereas Mizrahim are seen as being along a much kind of a more flexible sort of spectrum.
Yeah, complex continuum.
Because there is also an element within Israeli society which would say that this is what Mizrahim actually bring to the social kind of milieu of Israel, is this moderation. You would even classify it in this sort of kitschy way as like sweetness, right? How Mizrahim can be presented at one at the same time. It's so tragic what's happened in Israel, right? There's this sort of very, 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 very sort of simplistic understanding and kind of like mechanistic understanding of this thing as having happened on its own.
Yeah.
But I think what we try to argue in the article is that this is something that was engineered by the powers that be in order to prevent the emergence of a coalition between Mizrahim and Palestinians.
I really, really want to go back to the rape song to make the point that you're just talking about. So, but the reason that I find the rape song so useful diagnostically is that it reflects that structural, that the process that becomes a structural impossibility for Palestinians and Mizrahim to collaborate. And it starts. We talked about the kind of. We talked about Mami's appeal to the Palestinians in the song, where she's trying to tell them we're similar, and we haven't talked about the way that they reject her attempt.
גירשת את ילדינו בשם הדמוגרפיה, גזלת את שדותינו בשם הגיאוגרפיה.
So they say to her, addressing her in the singular second person, so very clearly just talking to her, you expelled our children in the name of demography. You expropriated our fields in the name of geography. You shut down our schools in the name of pedagogy. You called us Nazis and cockroaches out of demagogy. And for me, that really sums up the issue, because what happened here is that Mami, like many Mizrahim, was settled in lands that not, a year ago belonged to Palestinians. And so her body effectively replaced, not just displaced, but replaced, was put in the place where Palestinians used to be. I wanted to kind of try to connect that with the Abrahamic myth of Genesis. As you were talking about the splitting of the Middle East and North Africa, we can broaden it a bit into nations and the creation of national minorities or ethnic minorities within. I was thinking about the fact that Hagar is presented as Egyptian. The entire story is a story of this mythical origin of the other. Abraham comes from elsewhere again and again and again, not only at the beginning of the story, but then he goes to Egypt and comes from, Um, so the whole story is the story of justifying belonging or identity, and at the same time, it's creating the other, the Egyptian, um, as someone who doesn't belong. It's the son that that is not the right son, but it still exists, and that needs its own genealogy. Like the other cannot just be, a foil or someone who comes from elsewhere. It's still part of the same story, the same father, the same God. It's just not the right son. And there's something about that is really interesting for the kind of division and ethnic splicing that has happened in the Middle East, and the way that genealogies have been invented for all of those things.
And with we could go very, very far with the etymologies, of course.
Oh yes,
Hagar means to migrate, and Arab means to mix, and Hebrew means to pass. So all these names have these multiple meanings within them. But I think that's a good place to end, right?
Okay.
We went through a lot in this episode today.
Yeah, I think this is maybe our toughest episode in terms of subject matter.
All right, well, we should probably go over it one more time.
Okay, yeah, sure, let's try. I think we spent a lot of the first half talking about Christian perspectives on the Abraham story, the allegorical and the literalist one. So the first perspective sees Christianity as being born of the promise and the spirit. That is Sarah. And both Judaism and Islam is born through the flesh. It's kind of sordid, petty, fanatical law of those Oriental cousins.
Yeah, Hagar.
And the second Christian perspective reads scripture much more literally, so that Israel, is the people of Israel, is the state of Israel. And they come together in a way in Christian Zionism, which basically assimilates Jews to the Christian camps against the Muslims.
Right, but we also talked about this Faisal Weizmann romance, which points to the possibility of almost like a Muslim Zionism.
Yes, we saw Faisal affirming his kinship with the Jews. That's a sort of prototype, I would say, for the Emirati or Saudi attitude towards Israel today.
And then we went into the conversation with Liron, and we got into the gender aspects of the story.
Yeah, so the rape song in Mami that we discussed at length shows us how the possibility of Arab-Jewish kinship is kind of ripped apart in modern Israel through this threat of sexual violence. Mami tries to point to another way, to a way of peace and even revolution, I would say. But both the Palestinian and the Jewish characters in the play, who are all male, they all refuse that possibility, and they kind of stomp it out of her. They make the game a zero-sum game for her.
Yeah, again, we move from this kind of complexity, dynamism to like black and white and zero-sum. And this zero-sum brings us back to Sarah and Hagar, and they're forced to fight each other in order to survive, right? That's the way the story is structured.
Yeah, we looked at how Sarah is taken up as this sort of tough cookie heroine by the religious right in Israel. But in a way, they misunderstand her, because they're looking at the story through these entirely male eyes. As Liron pointed out to us, Sarah plays the cards she's been dealt with in a game that has been stacked against her. And that's a lot like the Mizrahi situation in Israel today.
Honestly, it's quite bleak, Matan.
Yeah, but we're not going out on this note, are we?
No, we're not. We obviously are not going to end in a note this bleak, because we have another episode, the final episode of this series, where we're going to talk about the much promised and much delayed sort of positive progressive views of Abraham, right?
Yes, definitely. Final episode, and we're going to be looking really hard for progressive readings of the story. We'll discuss a really unique religious figure, Jewish thinker, Yosef Kamener.
Yosef Kamener is not a cousin of yours.
No, there's no relation as far as we know.
Unfortunately.
We'll also have some excellent guests on to chat about other sorts of forms of thinking positively, progressively about the Abraham story, about Hagar, of course, my favorite character.
Yeah. In the meantime, bye.
See ya.
This was Bad Cousins, Episode 5. Thanks for listening. Bad Cousins is a show by me, Benjamin Solar, and Matan Kamener. Our producer is Guli Dolev Hashaloni. Adam Mauer composed the music. We publish Bad Cousins in partnership with The Diasporist here in Berlin. Thanks for listening again, and see you soon for Episode 6.